Hello, welcome to Goth Farms. I love to make things, and I have no particular one type of thing that I like to make. Mostly, I just like to make things that I already want, already need, or already have look a little bit more spooky. With this, everybody who sews certainly has a little tomato pincushion. They're kind of not my style. They are classic though, quintessential if you would. And while I would love to keep the tradition, it's not quite what I'm looking for. So I decided I would make my own little tomato in my own style. Now, this required some research because the tomato pincushion is quite an old tradition. It's been around for a very long time, and thus it was not filled with normal fillings. And actually, there's some reasons behind things that I never knew about. For example, I found out that tomatoes are filled with sawdust, which is not commonly used as a filling, but it is great for using less waste. Reduce, reuse, recycle. I also found out that the strawberry, which I always thought never made any sense, actually is full of emery sand, which is used to sharpen or remove rust from your pins. I had no idea that it was full of that, which is so interesting because I've always had a tomato and I've always had emery sand, I guess, and never knew what it was for, that it was even in there. So I decided to make a pincushion in a similar style to the tomato, but with my own little twist, and so I decided to make a pumpkin. In my pumpkin, there is sawdust. I kept true to the original, but in the stem is the emery sand. I thought it just made more sense than having another fruit, and thus I made it, and I would like to show you how I did it.
So the first thing I needed to do was make a pattern. I had attempted this before already, but I didn't really like how it turned out. I did keep the pattern, and I decided to use it to make a pattern for one that I thought might be better. I did not follow this kind of symmetry when I made the one before, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just made it perfect because it's kind of easier. If you fold the paper in half and then fold it in half again, and you cut out just a curve along both folded edges, you should get a perfectly symmetrical pointed ellipse, which is exactly what we're going for. In my first one, I also used a different kind of fabric. I used canvas, and this here is just regular old cotton. Canvas shows holes a lot more, and it looked like it could leak if the sawdust were a bit finer. It worked out okay, but I recommend going for something with a very tight weave or a very forgiving weave. Cotton is good for this because it's very forgiving. I just traced the pattern 6 times with tailor's chalk, and then I cut it out with fabric-specific shears. You don't have to use fabric-specific shears if you don't have them, but they do make the job a lot easier. And if you don't have them, but you're planning on doing a lot of sewing or just working with fabric, you should invest in a really good pair. They don't cost more than $30. Then it's time to thread the sewing machine. If you don't know how to do this, it's very simple. It should be instructed on your actual machine. You basically go from step 1 all the way until you reach the last step. If you want a more in-depth video, there's lots on YouTube, or I can make one. Now it's time to sew these little pieces together. I'm keeping the top edge very close to each other, starting the seam right at the very top, and I make sure that I backstitch when I get to the bottom because I don't want the thread to come undone. I'm not going all the way to the end of the bottom because this is something I'm going to have to turn inside out and then fill. So I'm going to need a hole basically at the end of this. After all the pieces had been sewn together in a row, all that remained was to sew the finishing sides together to complete a cylinder, basically. But I noticed it's not quite the shape that I want. I can't tell exactly what kind of shape it's going to be since it's not filled, but I could just tell it's not as round and wide as I wanted it to be. So I'm gonna have to cut out another one and sew that one on before I sew them all together. After sewing the end pieces together, I had to make sure that the bottom was very well secured. Otherwise, sawdust might fall out of it as I'm trying to pack it into the pumpkin. So I went back and forth and stitched over the bottom to make sure there was not a hole in sight. Then I went and filled it up with sawdust. Here I have my sawdust in a big pink bucket. I got this sawdust from Lowe's because, alas, I do not have a backyard or any woodworking tools, so I cannot collect my own sawdust. At Lowe's or Home Depot or any of your local wood cutting places, they have tons of sawdust from cutting wood for people, and the only thing they do with it is throw it away. So if you go in and you ask very nicely and you offer to help, they'll give it to you, usually for free. I got a very large amount for free, and I had to buy this $5 pink bucket. It didn't have to be the pink one, but I wanted the pink one. You have to pack it in really tightly. I used a spoon to get it in, and then I packed it in with my thumb, but it took a really long time. That's why I sped it up. And now here's a very slow video of me stitching closed the open part. This does not need to be anywhere near perfect because no one will see it. So just stitch it as closely as you can and try and make sure that there's going to be no escape of sawdust. For this, I just used any regular thread, but for the next piece, I'm using specifically embroidery thread. We're adding some decorative pieces while also perfecting the shape that we want. So I used a very thick thread. I like to use DMC thread because you have very good control over the color, and I know that it's good quality. Then I take a really long needle and I go from the top and I push the needle through to the bottom and pull it as tight as I can, and then pull that thread over one of the seams of the pumpkin. This helps kind of make the pumpkin shape and bring in the donut holes, if you will, to kind of form this donut. I guess, but more of a pumpkin. And then I just repeat the process until you've gone over every single seam. And it gives it a nice look of a pumpkin with the little sections, I guess, of pumpkin. Now it's time for perfecting and for the stem, which we are going to fill with emery sand. I first cut out the thing that you see on all of the tomatoes, which is basically what's covering all of my ugly stitches on the top. But it's kind of like the base of where the stem is going to be. I cut out somewhat of a star shape, and then I cut out a wide triangle for the stem. This I didn't really measure, which is going to turn out to be a problem. The stem is easy enough. You just stitch along the side until you've stitched all the way up to the very tip. And then I really wanted a special design. I wanted the tip of the stem to be kind of curly, like how you sometimes see in like cute pumpkin depictions in the fall and Halloween season. So I had to figure out how I was going to do that. Well, I had the brilliant idea of using tinfoil. It's very moldable and it's easy, and I have it in my cupboard, so very accessible. I shaped it into kind of a pointed wire. Pipe cleaners would also work really well for this, but unfortunately I did not have any of those. So I made my own little wire and I stuck it all the way into the tip. Then I had to figure out a way to stitch it onto the base without... Well, that was where the problem was, because I don't have thread that would look natural, and so I just used my brown thread, but then it looked like a weird circle around the stem, and I thought, ooh, I don't really like that. But maybe I can work with that and make it look kind of like the veins in a tree. So I spent a long time stitching a bunch of decorative stitches. And then a lot of time passed, that's why it's dark now. So then I decided to fill it with emery sand and then sew it closed. This was a terrible strategy. I do not recommend this. I got emery sand everywhere, including inside of my machine, which is not good because it is abrasive. And that could be a problem in your machine, especially since I just got this one. Now I get to kind of play with the shape, and I start to twist it around, and I noticed it was looking kind of big, and it wasn't really shaping the way I wanted it to, and it looked just really big on my cute little pumpkin. And I thought, this might be a problem. I might have to remake this. Now the good news was that that one fit perfectly onto my bigger pumpkin, which still didn't have a stem on it. But the bad news was that I needed to make a new one for my new little pumpkin. So now I've got to trace the pumpkin again, make a better base for it, and hopefully find a different way to attach the stem, because the last one got emery sand everywhere. Now once I have the stem that I have sewn, I'm making little cuts, so I'm holding it like basically flat, and then I'm cutting so that it makes a cut on the front and on the back, and then I'm turning it so that I can make the same cuts on the other side. So basically you're making like a square, if that makes sense. There's 4 cuts total, that's what really matters. And then I'm making a new little tinfoil piece. I will say you should make it so that your tinfoil like really fills up the tip, because your emery sand is probably not going to stay down there because gravity. It's gonna all fall to the base of the stem. So you want to make sure it's like packed tightly in there, which I didn't do and I wish I had. With the piece of tinfoil all the way at the tip of your stem, you're going to fill it up with emery sand. I'm using a little teeny tiny teaspoon, just because it's so small, and I'm doing it over the bag because you really don't want to make a mess with this stuff. It's not dangerous and nothing bad is going to happen. You can just sweep it up, but it's like sand, so it's going to get everywhere if you let it spill. And then filling it up as much as you possibly can. Then I'm putting this little like circle I cut out of fabric at the top. I'm kind of pushing it into the sides to kind of, it'll look kind of like a pillow basically. But we're just trying to seal it up basically. I said that already. And then you're gonna put a drop of glue on top of the circle. And then you're gonna push that down and hold it there for a second. This is sped up, so I wanna insist, like, you're gonna hold it there for a second. And let it set for a little bit, then put another drop of glue and fold in the opposite side. And then do the same thing for the last 2 flaps. So now you see why we made those cuts at the beginning. And this is really gonna seal it all in. This is a much better technique than sewing it like I did before. And then just getting the excess off. You shouldn't use the box that your emery sand is in. And then here I'm just playing with the stem a little bit to see how it's gonna look. And I put a drop right in the middle and pushing it down in there. I also used fray check along the edge. And then you're done. You did it. It doesn't have to be perfect because no pumpkins ever look the same as the next pumpkin. So you can make it however you want, and you can make it even more whimsical. You could add a leaf, you could do whatever you want. And that's the cool thing about this, is that it's all custom. You can use any fabric, you can make it any color you want, you can make the stem as windy, and no 2 pumpkins are the same. So make all the mistakes you want.
Super naughty.